Our next speaker was to be Diana Rain. Diana was going to talk on sustainable hydrogen supply and demand at scaling up. Unfortunately, Diana is unwell this morning and is off with a sore throat. That's one hindrance you can't have when you're doing a webinar. Ian Williamson from the same company, High Energy Consultancy, the director, is stepping in Diana's place to give Diana's presentation. So we please send all our wishes to Diana for a speedy recovery. Ian runs High Energy Consultancy company based in the UK and acts as a business development director for companies finding their initial business in Europe and the UK. High Energy brings sector experience to bear in various EU-funded projects such as SeaFuel and GenCom, and prepares proposals for consortia such as the first ever Hydrogen Valley project funded by the Fuel Cell Hydrogen joint unit, the Heaven project. The company expanded its operations to the Netherlands last year. Ian has over 30 years experience in industrial gases, primarily in the hydrogen energy sector, having worked for Air Products. He's also been the CEO of one of the few British fuel cell companies, AFC Energy, so it's a wide-ranging hydrogen supply and application expertise. Finally, Ian has been the president of the European Hydrogen Association for the last 10 years. Ian, in Diana's absence, hopefully you can fill her shoes. You may be bigger feet, but hopefully you give us a good presentation. Over to you. Thank you very much indeed.
There's no chance of a better presentation, Paul. Anyway, good morning, everyone. And Diana does send her apologies. Hopefully, I can do a decent job with her slides. Today I'm going to be talking really around sustainable hydrogen and how the demand and the supply for that product is going to be scaling up over the coming decades. Just a little bit about High Energy. I won't spend too long on this. What as Paul's given us such a wonderful introduction, I don't need to, but we are involved in a lot of European projects. We work with a lot of different stakeholders, be they industrial, public sector, or in terms of national government. We do a lot of particular project applications, as well as participation in those projects, and particularly in terms of the Irish ones, SeaFuel and GenCom. So today I'm going to talk a little bit around where we are in terms of today, and look at how hydrogen can make a difference going forward, how certain countries are already preparing for hydrogen and how they're beginning to put hydrogen as part of their a central plank to some of their sustainability plans of the future. I'm going to look at how demand has grown or is projected to grow, and then tail that back into what the supply options are for those particular demand growths. So I think we've probably covered this a little bit in the earlier slides, but what we've all got to do is we're all making a transition towards net zero. We're all trying to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and this stems from the Paris Agreement, where many countries around the world signed up to an accord that allows us some hope that they will all move in the same direction in a consorted manner. And what you see in that top slide, if you compare the split of emissions between 1990 and 2015, you can see that we have made some progress in terms of changing the areas where we emit CO2 to the atmosphere, but the level of CO2 being emitted is still increasing. Now, in recent times, that's from an EU perspective, we've managed to achieve some progress. So the EU set out a goal back in, I think it was the early 2000s, to achieve 20% reduction of their CO2, their overall CO2 emissions, and when it was an EU 28 position, to get those reductions down from their 1990 levels down by 20% by 2020. And we did quite well. We've achieved a 24% reduction by 2020. So, the progress had been made, and it was a very positive position. However, obviously those initial gains are probably the easiest ones that we can make. And now we see with the change in the dynamics from the Paris Accord, from the environmental pressures that we're seeing in terms of the environmental activism that is putting pressure on governments to move towards a net zero target. We're seeing that if we continue at the same rate, and if we don't improve that position going forward, we're not going to get to that 2050 position. So we did have a 2035 or a 2030 position where we were going to achieve a 36% reduction in our carbon emissions. Now we're looking at that having to improve to be something towards 55%. And indeed, only last week the UK announced that it wanted to get to 78% by 2035. So we're seeing countries begin that restriction in terms of CO2 emissions and to accelerate it much more rapidly. But because we've already taken these initial steps, we've grasped the easier opportunities, and now these increased reduction elements are going to be harder to achieve. And as James has said, it's going to take a whole energy structure renewal to allow us to achieve the future goals. So how do we do this? Well, and again, this covers a little bit of what James was saying. What we're trying to do is couple different elements of the energy sector. So to date, we've had siloed approaches to energy. We've had the electricity grid, we've had the natural gas grid. But what hydrogen allows you to do is to connect both of those opportunities in the future. We can, using the natural gas networks and using the storage systems that James talked about, we're in a position where we can create our renewable electricity and store that until we can use it in terms of gas in different areas of our energy sector, so that they can be decarbonized at the same time. So decarbonization of heat, decarbonization of mobility, historically has been quite difficult using just electricity. And what we will see is the use of hydrogen to access these harder to decarbonize areas. So what we're looking at by, we've already seen this progress from 2015 through to 2020. We've seen the production costs of green hydrogen reduced, and we're already understanding that when we're in an industrialized environment, we probably aren't in a position to produce enough green hydrogen ourselves to allow us to do a full decarbonization job on our industry and our society. So we know that we're going to need to move hydrogen around. And the question is, how do we best do that? Do we do it in the form of chemicals like ammonia or methanol, or do we do it in the form of liquid hydrogen? And the jury is out in terms of which way it will be the most successful. But ammonia in particular is being considered by many larger projects, for instance, in Australia and in the Middle East, where they want to then connect those renewable assets that they're building in those countries to the applications that we're beginning to see in Europe, and using ammonia to do the transfer of that renewable energy. So just a look quickly at how the world is preparing. So we've all seen that many countries are coming forward with their hydrogen strategies. And I think to date, there's something like about 20 different countries have come forward with a hydrogen strategy. The UK is due to come forward with its in the summer. So those numbers will continue to increase. But if we just look at, I'm going to take the Netherlands as an example, just because they've got a plan in place, but also that plan is also being translated by different elements of society. So if we look at the overall national plan, and that's represented by that picture that you can see in the middle on the right hand side of the slide, you've got a whole series of clusters in the Netherlands which are industrial clusters, and those clusters will be used to drive the hydrogen economy within within the country. So they will act as the demand sinks for any hydrogen that is produced. You can see those little yellow lines. They don't come out particularly well on this slide, but those yellow lines are hydrogen pipelines that the pipelines that already exist. They're used for natural gas, but in the Netherlands, they're very lucky in that they have 2 natural gas pipeline networks, and they're beginning to turn off one of those pipeline networks to allow it to be transitioned to hydrogen. Now, they need to put in some intermediate connection pieces, but that will allow them to connect all of their 5 large industrial clusters together. And then when we take that even to a slightly smaller scale, and we look at an individual city, as an example, looking at Rotterdam, you can see that even individual cities have their own plans as to how to deploy renewables and how to make them work in a localized environment. And indeed, you can see the ships bringing in hydrogen into Rotterdam ports, or ammonia into Rotterdam port, already within the plans for the local city. So that demand, where is that demand going to come from? And I think, many of us have been part of this process over many years, and Paul was kind enough to highlight that I've been here for probably more than most. But we've been looking at hydrogen applications for the last 15 to 20 years. We've been deploying fuel cells in mobility markets. We've been deploying them in residential communities, and we understand how those pieces of equipment work. Now, of course, they can be optimized in the future, and that will definitely occur. But it will not necessarily stop the rollout of initial systems going forward. And the EU has a number of targets in place, and they're captured in the middle section of this slide. But we're looking at, the key ones here are the heavier duty applications, because they will migrate towards hydrogen much more effectively. So we're seeing multiple buses, trucks, and trains coming into a public space over the next 10 to 15 years. We're also looking at, in order to allow those technologies to be accessed by the public, we have to have an infrastructure behind that. And all of the technology that we've been developing to supply that infrastructure is available to us as well. We've been testing electrolyzers, compressors, storage systems over this whole period, and we understand how we can deploy these systems going forward. And it would be wrong just to point at Europe. We have this going on right the way around the world, and indeed, the Asian countries are very much accelerating much more rapidly than even Europe is in terms of their development of the demand applications. So what does that look as from an overall system? So on the left-hand side of this slide, you see that back in 2015, really hydrogen was an industrial feedstock. We didn't really see many energy applications, and it was primarily just used as a chemical intermediate. But what we are beginning to see now, as we move from 2015 through to 2030, is that energy applications begin to grow the demand for hydrogen. And even by 2030, if we compare that back to 2015, we expect to see a doubling of the hydrogen demand. Now, if we then take that another stage or another phase forward between 2030 and 2050, we can see that number quadruple again. And that is when we get into looking at these very large-scale energy applications, and we get the complete changeover of our energy systems. So how are we going to produce that energy? That hydrogen? Well, there are a couple of pathways, and one is the completely green pathway that has been historically favored by the EU and many countries, which is the electrolyzer pathway, where we take an electrolyzer and produce hydrogen via water. And the other one is a traditional fossil-based system, but we introduce the sequestering and capturing of CO2 and potential use of the CO2 from those fossil-based scenarios. Now, the UK and the Netherlands and maybe even some of the other EU countries believe that the use of what is carbon capture processes have a role in this next period, this next 20 to 50 year period, because the electrolyzer technology has not yet scaled up to be able to provide all the hydrogen that we will require. So going forward, electrolyzers are going to be the more favored route, but the CO2 route, the CCS route, will buy us time to get those to scale. So how do we see global hydrogen demand developing? Well, again, this repeats a little bit of what I said in that slide earlier, but instead of that being a European picture, this is a global picture. And we're seeing the same sort of transition move forward in terms of the energy applications. What we're looking at in terms of the overall picture is that approximately 14 million tons of hydrogen will need to be produced by electricity by 2030. And that, if you translate that back to just doing it via electrolyzers, that represents 89 gigawatts of energy. So the European Union has stepped forward and put in place a goal to deliver 40 megawatts of that 89 gigawatts by 2030, which will get to approximately 40-odd% of the forecast put forward by the IEA. Now, getting to 40 gigawatts of electrolysis in the European Union by, and this is supposed to be operating by 2030, I think is a massive stretch in terms of technology and resources. If we can achieve that, I think we'll have done very well. So what are we seeing in this scaling up of electrolyzers as we go forward? We're seeing that the cumulative capacity of the installed electrolyzers are growing. So we're seeing that the numbers of electrolyzers, the total output of the total infrastructure that we've put in place is getting significantly bigger, and that is like a hockey stick curve. So we expect that to continue to grow very rapidly. And we're also seeing that the average size of those electrolyzers that we put in place, that's also growing. So not only are the number of electrolyzers growing, but the size of each electrolyzer installation is growing. And again, if we just look at that on a nationalized basis, and I'll take you back to the Netherlands for this particular slide, we see that there are many 100 megawatt plus projects being facilitated, being designed, being developed at this particular moment in time, right the way along the coastline of the Netherlands. And I would expect that this would be a very similar picture to what we will see in the coming 5 years. Now, the Netherlands got there early because their government has pushed this green agenda a little bit in advance of what the EU have put forward and what the UK government have put forward. But that doesn't mean to say that we will not catch up and we will not accelerate the number and size of these installations going forward, primarily because we have the renewables resource, as James has pointed out and as others have pointed out, available to us to allow hydrogen to be a very successful transition fuel for ourselves. And where do we see these electrolyzer projects occurring around the world? Well, the predominant number is in Europe, and that's because of the agendas being pushed by the governments in the EU and the UK. We see very little activity in the US and in South America. We see clustering around Australia because of Australia's desire to act as a powerhouse into the Asian community. And we also see a number of projects around Korea and Japan. So all of these systems are coming forward all at the same time. But those big, bright blue dots, the big scale systems, of those 228 systems, you've got just over 10 what I would call world scale systems at this particular moment in time. And they are all in development. None of those exist today. The first ones should begin to come online by 2024. Or 2023-24, if everybody gets their act together and gets the technology up and running as quickly as possible. So the other thing that is going to change as these electrolyzers get bigger is that the business models within the electrolyzer space will also change. So at the moment we have electrolyzer companies building electrolyzers that fit inside containers, and then those containers get deployed into the marketplace. Well, we can do that up to a certain size, maybe say 10 megawatts. We might even get 20 megawatts into a containerized system in the future. But what will happen with these 100 megawatt or 1,000 megawatt or gigawatt size systems is that we need a different way of doing that. And the electrolyzer companies are not, let's say, they only do the balance of plant of their systems because in the early days, nobody else would. And so what we see when we get to these bigger projects is that there are other companies with different skill sets that can build a balance of plant for a bigger array of electrolyzer stacks more capably than the electrolyzer companies themselves. And these are the EPC companies that traditionally execute large-scale chemical and electrical investments. And that when those EPCs get involved, they also guarantee the operation or the delivery of that particular system. So we're going to see the electrolyzer companies begin to focus much more on their stacks. They'll migrate to producing many of those stacks, and we see those stacks then integrated by the EPC companies in bigger, larger installations. So that's a slight change to what we see at the moment, where the electrolyzer companies build everything and roll everything out. So that change is happening at the moment, and you can see the integration of certain companies where they're beginning to find partnerships around the world to allow them to access EPC capability to get to those bigger scaled systems. So in summary, at the moment, we've got a lot of environmental legislation being rolled out by governments. We've got a lot of targets being rolled out by governments. And we know that that means that hydrogen will play a role in this sustainable energy future. We've only really just begun to see the change really that's going to happen. Just like James has pointed out, this whole process is going to take a decade to maybe 15 years to occur. But in the overall scheme of things, that is going to be amazingly quick. And we also see that, you know, just looking at the projections from the financial institutions of the scale of this business going forward, we're going to see this quadruple or even to a multiple of 10 times very quickly over the next decade to decade and a half. And that's us. That's me finished. Or that's Diana finished, I should say.
I don't think Diana could have given a better presentation. It's her material, but I think you translated it very well, Ian. Thank you very much indeed.
I think you're being kind, Paul, but that's very kind of you.
I'm in front of a global audience, so I have to play my best man. Couple of questions for you, Ian, before we progress on to the next speaker. Is you've talked there about how hydrogen has made an impact so far, and it's similar stats that Thomas gave at the start. For 2003, we had only 5% Northern Ireland renewables. By 2021, we're going to 50%. The same with hydrogen. Have we eclipsed all the low-hanging fruit, the easy-to-achieve targets, and will the next stage be a somewhat steeper incline? And in order to navigate that incline, you talked earlier where bigger companies are coming together to get more push put behind it, or will there be a step change to look at some of the other targets where smaller scale electrolyzers, focused electrolyzers, co-located electrolyzers, for want of a better phrase, or co-located technologies could help address and improve some of the hydrogen targets, Ian?
I think you've got two things happening. One is that you've got the industrial base needing to decarbonize as quickly as possible, and that's going to create a series of enormous hydrogen hubs and hydrogen potentials. But that's going to be around the existing industrial clusters that we see. Just like I talked about in the Netherlands, where they have 5 industrial clusters. The UK and other countries have their own industrial clusters, and we will see those being the drivers of big hydrogen projects. But then if we look more into the more rural elements of the decarbonisation, we're going to see different technologies align with other hydrogen production methods. So we could see, for instance, the aligning of, or the co-locating, as you put it, Paul, of electrolyzers with water treatment works or with biogas facilities in the future to maximize the potential of the renewable footprint that we see from both of those facilities going out.
Because one of the things, just to finish off with this one, the question is, innovation is going to play a more and more important role as we move forward. If high energy, Ian Williamson had the crystal ball, what is the next big step in innovation in the hydrogen production process that's going to make our world more sustainable in our goal towards net zero?
Well, the next step is, can we get these big gigawatt facilities? And it's not necessarily the alkaline electrolyzer, and I haven't gone into this in this talk, but there are 2 or 3 different technologies that we're talking about here. And the traditional one, the older one, the more mature one, is an alkaline technology. The question is, can we get the new up and coming one, which is called a proton exchange membrane, or a PEM technology? Can we get that technology to scale up rapidly? If we can do that, and we can integrate it really quickly within the renewable energy sector, then we get to have significant amounts of hydrogen available without potentially needing to go to the CCS route. Now, the debate here is, how quickly can those bigger electrolyzers be created, and can the technologies be scaled quickly enough?
So what you're saying there is, there are opportunities, people engaging, and for countries such as Ireland, Northern Ireland, that are looking to develop their hydrogen plans, where other countries are already talking about billions, there are still supply chain and energy chain opportunities for everybody to engage to get their geographical hydrogen answer.
Oh, absolutely. Look, I mean, when we look at the countries that don't necessarily have this very focused chemical sector, which is where the hydrogen sector historically has been prevalent. All of those communities, all of those countries have an opportunity to embrace hydrogen in a slightly different way to those industrial locations. And what I see is that those communities and those countries get get value through a different route. They get value through looking at the fact that they have a completely new energy resource that they can maximize its potential using hydrogen, and then maybe even use it to spill hydrogen back out of their local economies into other economies, and thereby create an export market for themselves. Because, as I said, moving hydrogen around the world is going to be one of the not necessarily as pure, definitely not as compressed, and probably not as liquid, but in the form of chemicals in the future. We're going to see that begin to happen more and more.
Ian, thank you very much indeed. If you can stay on, then we'll bring you to the main Q&A at the end.